when I start is when the platform picks us up. Well, folks, I want to welcome you back to the session, and we are in the session reducing contingent labor risk while streamlining the contracting process. So I hope you're all in the right room with us today. I am so excited to introduce you to our panelists. It's going to be a great group. We have Mike O'Brien, who's Chief Procurement Officer and Head of Contract AI from AppOrchid. And most of you probably know Mike from his BP days. That's how we all got to know Mike. But he was in charge of procurement at BP, and then before that, he also serves as Chief Procurement Officer for Aviva North America, a large global insurance company based out of the UK. He's also held several other senior positions at ABN AMRO, including Head of Infrastructure for the Americas. And now he's with, which I'm not surprised because he was such a big fan of AppOrchid. So I'm not surprised that you ended up there. But Mike, congratulations on the move, and they are so lucky to have you. So I'm glad you're here today.
Thanks, Tom.
And then with us today, Scott Brewer, Global Practice Lead, Procured Services Management, SOW, Randstad SourceRight. And Scott has over 10 years of services procurement, SOW, managed service provider solutions experience within the contingent workforce space. He has spoken at a number of different conferences, and he leads educational webinars on the topic of optimal SOW program management. So he currently leads Randstad SourceRight's SOW Procured Service Management practice and is responsible for their global service offering platform and go-to-market strategy. And with us today is also Eric Cohen, who's the Chief Procurement Officer at HCL Technologies. In this role, he leads HCL's global procurement and supply chain organization in delivering category management, sourcing, and procurement operations for all external spend categories, including technology, labor, facilities, travel, HR, marketing. In addition, he sits on the U.S. Employees Benefits Council and chairs the HCL 401 Investment Committee. Now that's interesting. I haven't seen that before on a resume, Eric. That is really neat.
It is a neat experience.
Yeah. So investment advice, we go to Eric.
Well, no, I'm not allowed to give fiduciary. Part of the rule is I can't give investment advice. That's where the line is drawn. So.
Oh, okay.
So I can give you offline.
We'll talk over drinks later.
Yes.
And simultaneously, he also serves as a global sourcing and contract management process lead, in addition to the global IT category director role. So Eric, I want to welcome you as well. And Eric, I also understand you have a number of employees over in India that have been affected with the current pandemic, and that we did talk earlier about the situation. So I just want everyone to know that our thoughts and prayers are going out to everybody with teams over in India right now.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to go off camera, and you guys can take it away.
Great, thanks, Don. So yeah, I guess we're going to talk a little bit about contingent labor. I think most companies have a little bit of contingent labor. I've got two experts here that would maybe just start talking about the difficulties, the risks that we run into, and contingent labor. What are some of the risks that are out there? And I know that we've also seen that contingent labor is turning into more managed services now in some situations. How do you deal with that? Maybe I'll start with Scott. Maybe you can take that one and start.
Yeah, absolutely, I can. And so, what I think is important to talk about with contingent labor procurement is how different it is from actual typical commodity management of supplies or materials. And there's an inherent ambiguity and variability in the terms of what you're buying and how to assess the actual delivered services. And if you think about it, those services are delivered through people. So when you have people as part of the services that you're buying, it actually brings in regulatory concerns and stipulations that you ordinarily wouldn't have to think about.
Thanks. Eric, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just tack on with some details and examples with what Scott talked about. So we are a multinational company. We've got about 150,000 people all over the world. about an additional 10,000 or so in our contingent workforce. And we're in about 60 countries where we have workers. And you run into different issues in certain countries. So where you can't necessarily, how you contract with labor vendors is different. In some countries, you're restricted. If, for instance, you're guiding the work, or they're driving their own work every day, are they sitting at the client site or not? That's a distinction in some countries that we have to worry about. In our business, probably about 80–90% of our contingent labor workforce is supporting our customers and supporting our revenue. So perhaps, in other roles I had in other companies, our contingent labor force was mostly supporting our internal functions. But here at HCL, they're supporting our customers. So we have sort of the employment kind of construct and rules that we have to work around. We also have our contractual terms and conditions under which we sign up with our customers. I'm sure Scott deals with this also. We refer to that as flow downs. So if our customers have certain requirements they're putting on us, some of them will shoulder, and we won't pass them down to the agencies, but many of them will have to. And so figuring out what those are, how to perhaps, we're okay signing a 300-page SOW with terms and conditions with our customers because our contracts are really big. But the agencies may have 2 or 3 or 5 people on the project. Certainly that makes no sense, right? So how do we distill that down into what they can understand, they can agree to, and we can manage? It adds a lot of cycle time. And we have to balance between having to do that for every single agency. And one might say, well, why don't you just have fewer agencies? Well, on paper that might sound great, but when you need niche skills in certain countries at certain price points, we sometimes you have to have flexibility in your supply chain as well. So balancing those, it's a constant balance of more suppliers, fewer suppliers, flow downs, the agency models that we engage with is kind of a risk management juggling exercise.
And I was just going to add, in terms of the risks that are associated with contingent labor. So you've got the 2 typical channels. So you've got contingent or with temporary staffing, and then you've also got services procurement, which is managed services buying and also managed project buying. And the risks that we see in the marketplace are related to those variable factors that I talked about in terms of having people as part of the equation and the ambiguity of a delivered product. From one of the items that we hear about or see or have to deal with is co-employment exposure. And temporary staffing agreements are typically short-term in nature. So by nature of how brief the assignment is, oftentimes it bypasses the criticality or the screening of co-employment. But services buying can be different, especially when it's outsourced services, and it can be 2 or 3 years long, and there's close interaction between the buying company and the providing service company. And so the risk that we see is that the co-employment concerns rise when the needed behavioral separation isn't written into the agreement itself, and it isn't being followed at the specific work site. So you're losing that entity separation. A good SOW really should specify, these are the rules of the road. These are how we're going to work together. This is what I'm going to do for you. This is how we're going to handle dispute management. And then that becomes the script, basically to follow, to make sure the behavior actually matches the contract. And when we see where those controls are not as enforced or as in place, it does open up that environment.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it just, go ahead, Eric.
I would say I'd also add there's the governments intentionally have vague rules. It's not necessarily black and white. They'll give you 5 to 10 checks, and if you're if 6 or 8 kind of lean this way, then you're that. If 2 or 3 lean this way, you're that. So for instance, you read some of the guidelines in the IT world, some of them don't even make sense. Some of them will say, does the person provide their own equipment? So if the answer is yes, likely they're more likely a contractor. If the answer is no, they're more likely they're kind of a deemed employee. Well, in the IT world, you're often going to supply your contractors with your own laptop, your own image, your own corporate laptop. It's just not worth the effort to have them bring their own laptop into the environment. So that doesn't make any sense. Sometimes it has to do with swappability. So it's more likely a managed service when you're not necessarily buying, Mike O'Brien, you're buying, a guy who can do X, Y, Z, and the vendor can give you anyone who can do X, Y, Z. Well, that may work if you're talking about the guy who's cutting your lawn. You don't necessarily care who's cutting your lawn as long as it's cut. But I just spent 6 months or 6 weeks training Mike on what I need here. You can't bring me someone else the next day. In your case, it took longer to train, but we'll put that aside. Right. So I mean, some of these things, they don't make sense in the context of what we're doing. So you have to kind of look at that with some intelligence and kind of try to figure out, what's the real meaning of those checks, because it's not always clear.
And with both of you guys as enterprises, this is a high volume game for you guys. This is like a onesie twosie where you're going through all these different variables.
And for us, it's revenue generating, as I mentioned. So, we don't have the luxury as if it were internal capability where we're looking maybe for the internal IT team or the HR team or whatever to wait a week, wait a couple of weeks. A day a contractor isn't on site working is likely a day we can't bill him or her, or maybe we're not working towards a deliverable that we would be getting paid for. So for us, it really is a raw material, lack of to kind of get down to it. I mean, that's what it is. So for us, it's the speed also. So again, how do you balance that risk, the cost, and the speed?
Yeah, for you, it's a direct spend, not an indirect.
That's right. That's exactly right. And for Scott as well. I mean, that's his business, right? You could argue we do what he does internally for our own guys. Yeah.
And to your point, so it's thousands of SOWs that run through some of the clients that we support. So it is really critical to have that technology and that view into the elements of risk that are in the contract.
Yeah. In our case too, about ownership of the deliverable, right? So we're working for a customer who may or may not be owning that IP that we're working on. And then we may, then if we own it, then the question is, how do we make sure our agencies don't own it, or maybe they do own it, right? I mean, consciously, we may decide to do that. So that IP ownership, and then when you are passing license up the chain, do you actually have the right to do that, right? Just because some contractor said, on paper, you say that we own all of the IP you work on. Well, he might have been moonlighting for Microsoft, right? And some code that showed up in Excel, he just gave to us, right? So he had no right to give it to us, but how do I know, right? So that gets tricky as well. So a lot of risks in this area.
Yeah, a lot of variables.
One of the items that we see from a business protection standpoint, I think Eric was starting to touch on that, is defendable positions for services promised and payment release of those. So we talked about compliance risk earlier. I think there's also a risk saying if your contract isn't structured properly, if it has vague deliverables, vague acceptance criteria, it doesn't have service levels that are in there or specifies non-performance remedies, it puts the buying company at risk in case of default. And I'm sure, Eric, you probably experienced this, you too, Mike, during the COVID surge, a lot of projects got canceled. We saw it a lot on the consulting side. And what ended up happening, both sides had to come to the table to determine what have I paid for, what did I get? And it became gray for a lot of contracts that weren't structured well. I think companies have learned about it, but until that really gets better in the industry for a company, it's going to be an exposure area for them.
Yeah, coaching teams on what a deliverable is. I sometimes I have to be sarcastic and say the moon going around the earth is not a deliverable. That's not a milestone. That's a time thing. So if you pay the guy because the month's over, or they show up today, that's not a deliverable. A deliverable is something you can hold, you can validate, and you can go tell them it's wrong and they got to redo it on their own dime, right? And you're not going to pay him again, right? Yeah. That's a deliverable. That's a deliverable. And if he finishes a day early, you're still going to pay him the amount you said, not because. So that's. And when you start saying things like that, it kind of brings things home to people because they think milestones would be all right. Well, a week's a milestone. It's like you're missing the point intentionally, perhaps.
I love when you see a milestone and it's January.
Yeah,
or it's February, right? And then, okay, that's the only one where there's a deliverable with a dollar amount. On your other contracts, you'll see a deliverable section, and there's no mention of the billing amount until you get to the end, and it says we're going to bill you $12,000 a month anyway, and it's not really tied to the deliverable. So we've seen some doozies, I'm sure.
Yeah. So
we just had to go through. I don't know if anyone here is dealing with UK contractors, but they just implemented a regulation called IR35, which what they tried to do is get contractors that were really deemed employees who were working as independent contractors and weren't paying the tax that the government felt they should be paying. And there was no withholding because they're independent contractors. So that went into effect. And what the government decided to do is they put the burden now, not on the worker, but on the end customer. So us, sometimes it's our client. And maybe in our case, we had about 700 or so, 600 contractors in the UK, maybe half. Our client was the end user, and that means who's directly benefiting from the service of that person, or it would have been us. So maybe we're providing a service to the customer and we're using some temporary workers to support that. We're the end customer. So the burden would be on us or our customer. So it's no longer, can you just let the worker do what he wants to do, which you can kind of, if the US, if you're paying a supplier and he or she, they're not submitting their tax returns, well, you're not in trouble for that, right? But in the UK, in this use case, they made the end customer responsible. So we've had to put a program in place to drive that result, fix that issue, which mostly meant that these workers now were getting 20, 30% less take-home pay because they had to pay taxes, they had to pay into the national insurance system, which they weren't necessarily paying for before. And of course, they wanted to spin stories on how they weren't supposedly inside IR 35 by these deliverable based. Like, I get in, kind of what Scott was talking about, a month is not a deliverable.
So you guys obviously are doing this at such scale. What kind of technology are you guys looking into or using already to try to streamline? You guys are doing it at such a high scale. What type of things are interesting to you? What have you been successful with using? What do you see a great future in, and things that you're exploring?
I'm going to go first.
Sure.
Yeah, so we're looking at a lot of the providers in the industry that have a contract reading and AI functionality, and then also have the contract creation, like the guided creation in the beginning. And the first part that I was talking about, we're going after specifically to deal with the volume situation that you talked about, Mike. There are just thousands of contracts coming through. And what we're often seeing is that companies start with a template, but then it'll get swapped out, or supplier language will get put in there, or it'll just be the supplier's paper. And so with all that variability coming in, we're looking for a tool that can analyze that and take the company standard and analyze the data that's coming in to solidify the risk, identify it, and then a corrective strategy to go forward. And it's to handle that variation and the volume that's there. And the one thing before I hand it over to Eric is that what we see a lot with clients is that the scrutiny for current contracts is really for the ones that are of larger dollar value, and the ones that are below 100,000 or below 200,000 are relying on the SOW owner to draft it on their own with a brief procurement approval. And so that's the other piece we're going after, is the part of the spend that probably is a death by 1,000 cuts, but needs to be part of that discipline and contract rigor to bring it into a tool like that.
Great.
We've got a number of technology initiatives going on around in the services space. On the one hand, the payment process, we have a couple technologies we're looking at to make that more seamless and also take advantage of our payment flow, things like dynamic discounting, which in this space, in the services space, often it's a low margin business. It's a cash business. It's not like they've got IP that they're selling us. So for them to get their cash quickly is of high value to them. So we're taking advantage of that. On the complex services, we're looking at some technology that helps us kind of generate requirements with an AI underpinning and get exposure to suppliers that we may not have known of before. They're not maybe the names that just come top of mind, and give us an efficient process in order to evaluate those suppliers consistently and transparently and get to an outcome fairly quickly. And then third area, and it was not accidental that Mike invited me to this meeting, is some things we're looking at with Mike's company. So we've got about 500 then active contingent labor agencies. We've got 10,000 workers. Do the math. We've got a lot of small vendors also. So we're always bringing on more vendors. And on one hand, ones might say, just go with the big guys and minimize your risk. Well, said before, we have this thing about speed and niche skills. So I can't let having a beautiful category strategy drive the business, right? The business has its needs. We have to go fast. So fortunately, in the contingent labor space, we're the gorilla at that table, so we can drive the contracting. So we use our template. Okay, great. So what we're working on with AppOrchid is the contract AI tool, which would help us run contracts creation, I'll call it, kind of in parallel instead of in serial. So we've got a limited legal staff like most firms do. And if you think about, you send paper out, you get red lines back, and you have this cycle that takes time, and it's going through a critical bottleneck. Well, what Contract AI is allowing us to do is actually have the AI engine and the supplier kind of work on that together after we've set up what our boundaries are. And then when they're done, we get the result. And what I'm excited about for that is I'm going to be able to do contracting proactively. Like, really, to me, proactive would be like 1 week before I need it. That's what proactive is for me. So I can do it proactively, right? Get it out of the critical path. So then when, let's say I got a new business in IoT devices on like farm equipment, like there's a new capability our company wants to do. Well, we don't have a big stable of vendors who can supply us there. So if I can go get them on board today, so when I have a need in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, that's no longer in the critical path. And again, go back to what I said before, I get these people on staff chargeable, now we're making money, right? So this will be a speed to revenue kind of thing. It'll also give us a holistic view of what kind of risk are we really taking. So you have your template, which tells you what you kind of think you want, and then you have reality on what you're signing up. And the way this typically works is that you argue against your standard until you have no more time, right? And then you're done. That's really not risk management, right? That's something else. So working with Mike and his team is how do we really define what's more critical? Is 90-day pay terms versus 60 more critical than $1 million of insurance versus $500,000 of insurance, or whatever those trade-offs are. So we'll be making that in a systemic way, in a transparent way, in a reportable way, and also let us go faster. So I'm real excited about that. And then we can have our legal folks work on the more complex services that we're dealing around IP and other risks that we need their assistance on, and not contract drafting.
One of the pieces I thought was compelling about the tool too is the way it teaches and trains you, or spotlights those suppliers that are targeting certain clauses or are habitual, I shouldn't say offenders, but those clauses that are causing the most challenge, either as an organization or for a particular supplier, so that it becomes corrective, right? If that's a troubled issue or an item in that clause, you can fix it in your template upstream. And it's a way to diagnose problems in your contracting process and, go spotlight it to take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting to me, and one of the things that I've been seeking to do with like the products as I develop them, is, how do we make contracts more consumable or accessible to individuals, right? So often, a contract is done and it's signed and it's put into the file cabinet or the repository, never to be seen again until there's a dispute. And it really shouldn't be that way. It should be out there and accessible for both the supplier and the customer to understand, what did we sign up to? Because what I found is, we guard our side of the contract, the supplier guards their side of the contract. Nobody really, the folks that are actually delivering service, no idea or even access to what's in that contract. So they do what's.
There needs to be a better way. I mean, this idea that every contract is a work of art, that requires brain cycles to interpret. It just seems so antiquated, right? I mean, it just seems like, we're doing commerce over electronically using, whatever technology you have, where I don't have to print out a PO and fax it to someone who then types, who, maybe having some manual ledger. We've moved so far beyond that from actual purchasing itself and paying. But still, the agreement on what we're going to do still is this work of art, which is just such a waste of knowledge, just capital, brain capital. It just makes no sense that you have these smart people who drafting contracts, reading contracts, arguing over contracts. It might be fun, but you know, it's not, it just seems like such a waste, right? How do you just have a standard? Like, I don't even, the analogies I like to do is when I buy a lamp, I don't test it, you know, before I plug it in. It says UL certified, I plug it in. It works, right? How come we can't do so many other things that way? Like, we're just going to do business, and why does it have so much work up front to establish the boundaries? And I'm venting here. I don't have an easy answer, but it just seems like we need that.
To me, it's the people part of the process, right? Whenever you
Yeah.
introduce people, you introduce variation. So
That's right.
I think people start with a standard, but then they get it in Word and then they play around with it, and then it creates the variability because they want to customize it their way. And then it becomes the next contract I use.
Yeah.
Or if someone says, hey,
Right.
do you have that contract? And it gets sent over, and then it's sort of a
Right.
life of its
Right.
own.
You
When
know, you
start-
wonder in construction, we have the AIA standard, the architectural something. So it's a big, long super contract, and some of our architects will use that, or GCs will use that, and you kind of check off what works for you, right? You don't change any of the words, you just check off what's applicable. You know, I wonder if we move that to that world. That would be pretty cool. And I think, Scott, your company is in a position to really do that, right? I mean, you think about the number of agencies you touch, right, and customers you touch. You know, you get alongside some of the three other big vendors in your space, which you're probably handling, I don't know, a huge amount of the spend, and you guys come up with have a consortium and go develop the AIA version for staffing. So there you go. Tell us how that is next year.
Well,
Did you copyright that just then? No, I'm just kidding.
Just now.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you know, that whole idea of work of art. I mean, that's really what spurred when I was at BP to, you know, create Contract AI. Was I found 80% of our time was spent negotiating T's and C's, thousands and thousands and thousands of times.
Right.
You know, like this whole idea that we need a bespoke or custom agreement for every interaction between a customer and supplier. I mean, why is there not an ISO standard? I'd like to get there someday. And there shouldn't be, because that doesn't add value. And what I found was there was a kind of there became a chasm between, you know, procurement and the stakeholder, because that interaction between the procurement and the stakeholder wasn't happening, because procurement was always off on the side negotiating T's and C's and spending very little on the statement of work, deliverables, milestones. So I felt like there was an imbalance between where we were actually spending all the time and where the risk actually existed. So almost all the disputes that came to me in my career have been about statements of work, milestones, deliverables, acceptance criteria, SLAs. You guys can add on to it, but
right. No, you're right, exactly right. Rarely on the actual T's and C's.
Yeah.
Right.
And what we see is that procurement may have done a great job negotiating that contract and got the rates down, but then the actual delivery of it, you have the overages, the overruns, and people aren't going back to the original terms to say, really, this should necessitate a change order, or we should revisit this, or actually the original budget we approved is actually getting blown away. I think a lot of people miss the second part of that equation of the delivery and holding to the contract and then going back for the necessary change orders.
absolutely. And think about, you know, what if you were able to take some of that 80% of the time creating that work of art and actually work that into actually building those relationships with the stakeholders, actually doing that category management, actually learning the business of what you're buying. If you could take 80% of your day and actually focus it on that, you know, I mean, I'm sure you guys have had, you know, lots of people in your organization say, hey, you know, Eric, hey, Mike, help me. How do I get a seat at the table? How does procurement get a seat at the table? Well, it's not by doing 80% of your time not working with the stakeholder. That's for starters. But what if we could take that and actually, you don't have to ask for a seat at the table. The stakeholder will want you there, right? And that's something I saw in a difference between where I started out in my career doing like ITO and BPO, massive outsourcing agreements. Is that you work so tightly and closely with the stakeholders that you were a team. But in procurement, we seem to get further separated, and so that team and that value that's created seems to be that gap. And I'm looking to try, how do we use technologies to bring us back together and actually, you know, get all those things done, because T's and C's are important, but also is the relationship and what's in those statements of work and in those areas. So I think that's my goal. That's my vision and methodology into the products that I'm creating.
Yeah, if you want to sit at the table, get out of the kitchen.
Get in the game, right?
Eric, I have to tell you, and now I have to write that one down. I have written down more of your quotes today than I ever have in a session all week. Moon going around the earth is not a deliverable. Every contract does not need to be a work of art. And now if you want to sit at the table, get out of the kitchen. So very good. So
if I had a rupee for everyone.
No, that was great. Gentlemen, we are out of time, so we cannot get to the rest of the Q&A, but I really wanted to get into that home employment issue with you, Scott, because after Eric talked about it from the Great Britain perspective, UK, it's also changing here in the United States, and some of the regulations from the last administration have just been rolled back this week.
Right.
And so co-employment is going to be coming back on the table here domestically. And the bad thing is the IRS never keeps up until it goes to court. You know, I'm a bean counter CPA, so the regs are never going to be caught up by the time we go to court and fight these things on co-employment again. So lots of, and the other part that I wrote down, defendable position for services delivered is necessary. That is absolutely spot on. And I hope everybody wrote that down, that especially nowadays, we have seen so many contracts going awry. So words of wisdom from all of you. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, and Mike, thank you for inviting these folks. They were fantastic. They made you look good. So
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have to talk much at all. This has been great.
I know you sit back and lob a question and wait. So thank you so much. And folks, I hope you join us. I hope you come on and join us. We're going to have Dr. Bernie Banks up next as our closing keynote. Then we have a board meeting after that, but I hope you show up for the closing keynote. It's going to be fantastic on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he's a world-class leader. He used to lead West Point leadership for years and years before he left the military. So really interesting person. So gentlemen, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Don.
you. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.